Uh, so, good afternoon to all. Let me introduce myself. I am Sandeep, coordinator of TEAKNET. This year marks the 25th year of establishment of TEAKNET. And as part of our 25th anniversary, we will be conducting a series of webinars on the topics which are of broad topical interest to the TEAKNET community. So today we start the series with our distinguished speaker, Dr. CTS Nair, on the topic, the future of production and trade of teak, emerging scenarios in a changing world. Today, we have amongst us Dr. Thomas Hofer as our distinguished guest from FAO. He had kindly agreed to give the opening remarks. Over to you, sir, for your remarks.
Thank you, Sandeep. I hope you hear me well. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear colleagues. I would like to welcome you to this first webinar in a webinar series organized by TEAKNET. I would like, first of all, to congratulate the International Teak Information Network, TEAKNET, and partners for organizing this highly relevant and useful webinar series on teak, which I'm sure the stakeholders will definitely appreciate. This is indeed paving the way so meaningfully towards the 4th World Teak Conference in August 2021, which will be held in Accra in Ghana, which will be led by TEAKNET and the Forestry Commission of Ghana in collaboration with IUFRO and ITTO and technical inputs from FAO. I'm sure many of you will be planning to make use of this great opportunity to exchange knowledge and experience with teak, including innovations and emerging trends. I must appreciate the conference partners for thinking to launch a webinar series to celebrate the 25th year of TEAKNET till the Teak conference, where we will also discuss innovative business models for continued operation of TEAKNET. As many of you are aware, TEAKNET was established in 1995, so 25 years ago, as a follow-up of the discussion in the Asia-Pacific Forestry Commission session and with support from the Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific of FAO. The APFC Secretariat since then has been reporting its activities to the different APFC sessions. TEAKNET is a growing international network of institutions and individuals interested in teak. Its secretariat is based at the Kerala Forest Research Institute in India, and it addresses the interests of all the categories of stakeholders, including growers, traders, researchers, or other groups interested or concerned with teak. We are glad that TEAKNET has steadily grown in the last 25 years, and it has been enabling effective interactions and disseminating relevant information among the stakeholders of the teak wood sector. So it's meaningful to celebrate its 25 years of success story with a webinar series. Now, I am glad that the first webinar in the series will be delivered by my colleague, CTS Nair, who was a key architect for establishing the TEAKNET 25 years ago. He was with the FAO Forestry Department as its former chief economist and still continues to actively engage with us to advance the forest sector work, most recently in the development and the publication of the Asia-Pacific Forestry Outlook Study, which was launched successfully last year at the Asia-Pacific Forestry Week in Incheon, Korea. So I think CTS Nair is the best person to deliver the inaugural webinar, and I look forward to hearing his views on the future of production and trade of teak and its emerging scenarios in a fast-changing world, now ridden with COVID-19. I'm sure we all will leave this session with several messages that will help us think through more carefully for shaping a sustainable teak wood sector. I wish a great webinar experience today, and like all of you, I look forward to attending the future webinar in the series. Thank you so much. I look forward, CTS, for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hofer, for your kind remarks. Before inviting the speaker, I would like to briefly introduce him. Dr. CTS Nair has a diversified experience profile spanning about 50 years in forestry in India and abroad. He served as Director, Kerala Forest Research Institute, and Deputy Inspector General of Forest to the Ministry of Environment and Forest, Government of India, before moving to FAO. So he was with the Food and Agriculture Organization for about 20 years and worked in various capacities in Sudan, Thailand, and Rome. While working in Thailand in the FAO regional office, he was instrumental in establishing the TEAKNET in 1995. During his tenure in the FAO headquarters, he was responsible for undertaking various long-term outlook studies. Following his retirement from FAO, he served as the Executive Vice President of the Kerala State Council for Science, Technology and Environment, and also as the ex officio Principal Secretary, Department of Science and Technology, Government of Kerala. His main areas of interest are assessment of long-term changes in the use of natural resources, policy and institutional analysis, and science and technology management. Since 2013, he has been coordinating the FAO Executive Forest Policy course and played a key role in the preparation of FAO's Asia Pacific Forestry Sector Outlook Study 3, which was published in June 2019. He has also been supporting the APFNet activities, especially in designing and organic thematic training workshops. May I have the honor of inviting you for delivering the lecture, sir?
Thank you very much. Well, friends and distinguished audience in different countries, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you're all safe in your countries and making every effort to remain healthy and keep your high spirits during these difficult times. Now, these are unprecedented times requiring strong collective action, transcending national boundaries. Utmost importance has to be given for regular sharing of knowledge and experience in support of collective learning. It's in this context that TEAKNET is organizing this webinar series, giving an idea of the current status of teak production, trade, and of course, what actually the future holds. Now, what I'm trying to do is to sort of, I'll have a few slides, and I'll just sort of make this presentation, provide a bit of explanation, and I hope if you have any kind of questions or other thing, I'm sure the coordinator will be able to sort of put together the questions. You can sort of actually type the questions, and I hope to sort of give probably sufficient time for any kind of a discussion, because after all, I think all of us are in a kind of very difficult situation, and I'm sure many of you would rather prefer in the actually your workplace, in the field, in the forest, but unfortunately, I think for many of us, I think the situation is not that favorable. I think we're all sort of homebound, and I think let us take advantage of this and sort of do a kind of loud thinking as to what the future is going to be and how we are going to deal with the situation. So my presentation, the topic of my presentation is the future of production and trade of teak, emerging scenarios in a changing world. Now, I'm in fact fortunate to have a very long association with teak. My first assignment as a district forest officer in the state of Kerala in 1972 was actually planting teak. I've been clearing mixed moist forests, replacing it with teak plantation. And of course, I don't know how many of you had that, that situation. But at that time, teak was considered to be the most important species. And if you don't know how to plant teak, I think you are not qualified to become a forest officer. That was the kind of situation. So we have gone through the whole sort of issues relating to the seed collection process, raising nursery seedlings, preparation of stumps, preparation of the planting site, then of course, the whole sort of process of planting at the right time. Then the other major challenge we faced was, we used to have a tremendous problem with the weeding the plantation. So one of the options which we adopted was to introduce the Tongia system involving the local communities. So, you go through the whole process, including the thinning, final filling, and of course, organizing the sales of the products. So I've gone through this, for quite a number of years before I moved to my other jobs, and especially in the Kerala Forest Research Institute. I had the tremendous opportunity to interact with very competent researchers, senior scientists in the Kerala Forest Research Institute. Dealing with very different aspects of teak cultivation, like, for example, the soil properties, the change in soil properties, then a whole issue of pest and diseases. Of course, we had all the problems of defoliator and skeletonizer. Then the whole issue of the wood properties. We had a very competent team in the wood science division dealing with all the assessment, the difference between the natural teak and the plantation teak, the properties and that kind of thing. And of course, subsequently, when I moved to Bangkok, looking after a major program on forestry research in the Asia Pacific, I was fortunate to have a link with almost all the key stakeholders in the Asia Pacific, and that's probably when we established the TEAKNET back in 1995. I still vividly remember the day when we launched the TEAKNET, and the kind of expectation from TEAKNET. And of course, I'm very happy that TEAKNET has sort of really lived up to that expectation. Subsequently, of course, now after my long stint in FAO, I'm back home managing our plantation. Of course, I still have teak trees as part of my home garden system, as also as in the rubber plantation, because in the rubber plantation, along the boundaries, along the inner roads, we actually plant teak. And it's very interesting that we can get a substantial return from teak, the teak we are growing in rubber plantation when we complete the rotation of rubber. When you do the kind of final felling of rubber, you can also fell the teak trees and realize a substantial return. So I'm reasonably familiar with some of these issues relating to teak. Now, as you all know, teak is one of the most valuable tropical timber species, raised in, say, over 70 countries. It has a very long history of management of both natural forests and plantations. You have teak has been introduced to, say, Indonesia something like 400 to 600 years back. It has been introduced to Sri Lanka. India, of course, has some of the old plantations. In fact, I live in a place where just about 10 kilometers from the oldest teak plantation. So what we have accumulated tremendous experience on managing natural forests and plantations, with, of course, all the pros and cons involved in that. The interesting thing about teak is that you have a wide array of production systems. Of course, in the initial stages, it was almost entirely natural forest management, and of course the plantation started, were established over a long period, essentially to ensure that there is a sustainable supply of teak. Now, of course, it has become very much diversified. For example, you have the private investor coming and sort of investing in plantations, almost entirely focused on the commercial aspects. You also have the smallholders who are very much involved in establishing plantations. And again, within the smallholders, you have those who are doing plantations in small woodlots. You also have those who are actually sort of managing home gardens. Now, interesting thing is that if you really look at, teak is a species that has been on the vanguard of globalization in forestry for over 2 centuries. If you look at the history of teak planting or teak extraction, of course, In the early stages, it was almost a sort of monopoly of the king or the royalty. But when trade actually happened, I think teak was at the forefront of trade of timber. I'm sure you must have heard the story of how teak logs were collected from Myanmar and India and was being shipped to UK for shipbuilding. Of course, that story has never ended. I mean, it has gone to Africa, it has gone to Central America, and of course, the Southern America. And the fascinating thing is that India once one of the exporter of teak. Now it has become the largest importer of teak, including, for example, from the far distant supply sources in Central and Southern America. So it's a very fascinating story relating to teak, how it has changed over a period of time, especially during the last 100 years. So the thing what we have to really look at, suddenly we have come across a situation where things have almost come to a standstill. COVID-19 related disruptions have underscored several issues affecting every aspect of life. I mean, it has affected all of us. It has affected forestry. It has also affected teak without any issue. Now, what we are hearing is stories of mill closures, scaling down production, retrenchment of workers, plunging demand for products, cancellation of orders, and this have become very, very widespread. And we are also sort of confronting a situation where there are severe resource constraints for every actor, including the government. I mean, you find that governments, I mean, when the trade has come to a standstill, business is not flourishing, the tax income of governments have gone down, and the capacity of government even to support the healthcare system is, I mean, being compromised. Now, it's interesting that this event we could not sort of really visualize a year back. Now, to give you an interesting story, I'm shown this picture of the Outlook report, which FAO has produced in 2019. It was published in June 2019, just about a year back. Now, during the preparation of this Outlook report, we were actually sort of trying to work out the different scenarios. Now, what we did was actually to look at what are the kind of critical factors that will create disruptions in the normal process or normal trend. So we are looking at the disruptive scenarios. So we looked at all the different factors that will contribute to disruption. And of course, we identified the issue of a global pandemic. But then we had a lot of discussion, and we indicated that the probability of that happening by 2030 or 2050 is very, very low. So this was just about a year back, and it's I don't know how it happened. I mean, now this pandemic of COVID-19 has become one of the most disrupting factor that has contributed to. I mean, it has disrupted everything. So the thing is that these are things which becomes very unpredictable, and I don't think anybody could have sort of really predicted that this is going to really happen. So before I go into what I would like to say, I just want to give you a preview of the key messages that I'm going to put forth, because it's always good to sort of come up with the messages right up front. Now, the good news, I think no need to worry about the long-term prospects of teak wood production, processing, and trade. I think this I want to really emphasize. But we have a bad news, and that bad news is that it is going to be highly disruptive in the short and medium term. Demand will slump, and pathways of recovery will remain extremely challenging. And what really worrying is that we should expect high mortality of enterprises, especially those involved in the processing and trade or trade, more of those, especially those having current problems. So if you really look at the value chain as a whole, you have the production, the wood production as such, then of course you have the sort of processing, trade, and of course the final consumption. Now, what we are going to face is basically you have both, a problem on the demand side and also on the supply side. And the worst affected is going to be people who are actually dealing with the processing. Mills and factories and furniture makers, the people who are involved in trade, and I think they are really going to get affected. Now, the thrust of this discussion is assess the broad directions of future changes and what needs to be done in the context of emerging opportunities and challenges. So I'll just sort of give an indication of, an overview of the teak sector, what exactly is the future of teak, and of course, options to manage the turbulence. And, it's a very turbulent world. But I also want to give a early warning that, you see, we are in a situation where at this stage, nobody is able to predict what is going to be the future. And of course, you all know that, we have very sophisticated models about forecasting future and other things. But I must tell, as an economist, I think these models are valid only to the extent the validity of the assumptions under those models. And be aware that no modeling could actually help some of these things, because we are actually sort of in a situation where tremendous amount of uncertainties and unpredictabilities exist. So what we know about teak? Well, I'm sure most of you have stakeholders. I know you are working on different aspects of the supply chain, or you are either producers of timber, producers of products, traders who are involved in this. So I just probably this is already among the tropical hardwood species, teak is of course probably the most studied species, and of course it is probably the most valuable. In terms of market, in terms of value, and all those things. And almost every aspect has actually been looked into. As I mentioned earlier, we have a fairly good understanding of how to plant teak. What exactly are the kind of problems encountered, how to deal with the kind of productivity issues, how to deal with pests and diseases, what do we do with the sort of soil management practices, what are the kind of problems involved in continuous cropping. We have situations where productivity is actually declined over successive rotations. So all those information is already available, but you still find that there are major gaps in knowledge. For example, a lot of the information what we have is still fragmented, because there are hundreds and thousands of papers written on teak on different aspects. But if you really want to sort of come and look at an issue, probably it is not that easy. There are especially the issue related to what is exactly the kind of quantity that is produced, what is the area under natural forest, natural teak forest, what's the area under planted teak forest, how it is changing, what exactly are the productivity, what is the production, how much is actually traded, what are the trade flows. I think these are areas we still are in the domain of still unknown. Of course, there are fragmented information, but if you really ask for totality information, I think we have problems with that. I'm sure many of you have gone through this. I think the two publications we have been relying quite a lot on, especially on a kind of at different time points. I think one is the one done by Dr. Devendra Pandey and Chris Brown in 2000 in FAO. And then, of course, subsequently in 2017, just about 3 years back, UFRA has helped put together a kind of a good overview paper. And I think these two overview documents provide some broad indication at a global level as to how teak has been sort of performing, what are the kind of issues, how the plantation has progressed, how we have sort of reduced the dependence on natural forests, and of course, a whole lot of issues with regard to properties, trade, and all those things. Now, when you really look at the teak sector, it's as one of the earliest traded forest product. The teak sector is actually spread the different domains. You have a local domain, you have a national domain, and a global domain. What happens to teak sector is influenced by multiple factors, which spread over these three domains. Now, when you say local domain, essentially, of course, you need land, you need labor, you need, of course, a favorable environment. So basically, the kind of productivity is largely dependent on the local domain, labor, land, and of course, the skills of people, the technology available. At the national level, again, of course, the national broad macroeconomic factors influence. And of course, specifically, the policies, institutions, and the governance systems have a very important role in determining the production system. Now, for example, I know in the very early stages, growing teak was almost entirely in the public domain. I think nobody could actually grow. And even if you have teak trees in your home garden or you are growing, you need, a very protracted process of getting permission from the various department and forest department to sort of sell it. So you had, of course, fortunately, I think many of these rules and regulations have undergone changes. Global, yes, I think the market is largely global, and especially with the kind of trade, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Europe was one of the dominant, market. It still continues a dominant market, especially for the high quality deckings and those kind of things. India, of course, has become a major market for sawn timber, furniture, and of course, furniture again, China. These are some of the key players. So essentially, we have to really look at how teak sector is performing, spanning these three domains. Teak, of course, over a period of time, although originally it was confined to 4 countries, the natural distribution, Myanmar, India, Laos, and Thailand, it has spread over to almost about 70 countries. You can see, for example, we have Africa, it has been introduced right from the very early stage, so also to the Caribbean. And of course, very recently, during the last 20, 30 years, it has been gone to sort of a number of countries in South America and also to other countries. You have introduction to the Pacific, especially Solomon Islands, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, all those countries. So basically, it is one of the most widely planted tropical species. And the advantage is that it's very easy to grow. At least that's my experience. And in fact, at some point, we used to say that the science of forestry owes a lot to teak stump, because if you plant it at the right time, the right place, I think you're almost certain of about success. So I think that way it still holds a kind of priority for a large number of countries. And more importantly, it is actually a standard for measurement of all the properties, even now, in terms of quality, durability, strength, and all those things. So as far as the market is concerned, I don't think in the long term there will be much of a problem. So I just want to give a very broad statistics. We have about 29 million hectares of natural teak forests, mainly in Myanmar, Thailand, India, Laos, and PDR. Plantations, of course, about something like, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is where we tread into the domain of a bit of unknown. We know plantation exists, but we still are not sure about the exact area. So the recent report which produced by UFRO provides, varying estimates, something like, say, between 4.35 to 6.8 million hectares. 80% of it is in Asia, 10% in Africa, 6% in tropical America, and of course, we have the rest in the Oceania, like Solomon Islands and Fiji, and to Papua New Guinea and those countries. Annual harvest from natural forests and plantations is estimated to be about 2 to 2.5 million cubic meter. Now, this raises a question about whole productivity. Now, I'm sure you are all familiar with the productivity figures quoted. Now, if you have a plantation of, assuming the lower figure of 4.35 million hectares, and even if you assume a very modest mean annual increment of 5 cubic meter. Of course, we have plantations which gives probably 15, 20 cubic meter. Of course, I don't want to use some of the exorbitant figures used by some of the investors going, say, 40, 50 cubic meter. I think forget about those kind of things. Even if you assume you get about 5 cubic meter, you should be getting anything up to, say, 10 cubic meter. Of course, one reason being that some of these plantations are still relatively young. Probably, I think, we may be able to get a higher yield in the near future. Now, I just want to focus your attention on key trends. I have identified some 6 key trends. One, the declining role of natural forests and plantations becoming a major source of teak wood supply. So this is something very interesting. I mean, as far as I know, up to almost about, even in India, we relied quite a lot on natural teak forests, but in almost every country, there has been logging bans and natural forests are, the harvested stock. And of course, partly because there has been very severe depletion. The assumptions which we use for determining yield, I mean, I'm sure my friends from Myanmar will bear with me. We have the Brandis system of yield calculation. I think what we find is that, I mean, our successive rotations, there have been successive felling cycles, there have been reduction in yield. The good thing is that plantations have expanded and increasingly the plantations have become the major source. And the other major change that we have noted is that the emergence of new players, especially private sector, including investors and smallholders and new production systems. I think this is something very remarkable. I mean, there was a time when teak was almost a monopoly of forestry departments. I think that has changed. And when this has changed, there has also been tremendous change in the production systems in terms of the technology used, the markets, the rotation. All those things have undergone changes because of this, change in this, the ownership and the kind of the key players. Now, changes in policies and regulations, I think I mentioned this. I think the most important is actually sort of, permitting the kind of freeing up the market, freeing up our ability to trade. Although still there are problems exist in some countries, but on the whole, it has been accepted that people who are growing the trees, they should have a kind of unhindered access to markets and ability to sell it. And in fact, this has actually encouraged tremendous investments in private plantations, both by large investors as also by smallholders. And I think this is the major change that have come up. There has also been significant improvement in technologies. 30, 40 years back, we have been struggling with the various things, but there has been tremendous work, especially on the genetic improvement, clonal propagation has improved. And the other most important, which has transformed the sector, is the ability to use small dimension logs. I think I still remember when we were doing the first thinning in the plantations at the 4th and 5th year, we were never able to sell the thin material because there was no demand. But subsequently now you find that every small piece is actually taken. And I think this is largely due to the technological improvement in processing. And of course, there has also been the kind of expansion of trade and associated issues to legality, certification, etc. So these are the kind of a broad brush, framework for what's happening with regard to teak. Of course, I can elaborate on that when you really talk about technologies. What we find is that the technology exists, but the uptake of technologies have been sort of far from satisfactory. I mean, you can see, for example, we are talking about clonal material and other things, and you go to some of the plantations, you find that they are still relying on outdated technologies, with its impact on productivity and other things. In fact, a lot of the problems which we are facing with productivity is, still, coming from the poor seed selection and, of course, this kind of ineffective or inadequate management practices. Now, with this, let us go into the kind of future. Being a long rotation crop, what happens in the long term is of utmost importance. Now, when I see some of the old plantations here, which are, we have this old plot called Connolly plot, which I said about 10 kilometers from where I am staying. 45 meter tall trees, huge trees. So the question is that, how did they sort of really withstand, stand in this long term? And the people who have actually planted them, at that time, the rotations were very long. Started with 120 years, 100 years, 80 years. Of course, it has come down quite a lot, to 40, 50 years. And of course, private sector plantations, anything from 20, 25, So for us, still, it is extremely important to consider the long term. But at the same time, we cannot really ignore the short term, because the saying is that in the long term, we are all dead, and we need to really look after the short term. So striking a balance between the short-term compulsions and the long-term potentials has become the key challenge. In the long term, generally assessing the long-term potential is probably the most challenging in view of wide-ranging uncertainty. Now, for example, as an economist, when we really do kind of long-term projections, the extent of uncertainties actually increase. There are, so any projection beyond, say, 5 years or 10 years becomes riddled with uncertainties. But in the case of forestry, and especially in the case of teak, I think we are quite comfortable with the long term. Now, how do we look at this? If you look at the key drivers that impact long-term potential for forestry, I will identify 3 most important things. One, of course, the demographic change, especially the population growth, change in income, and of course, especially in the context of forestry, we should be really concerned about the environmental issues. I just want to give, a diagram produced by the World Bank, the report which has just come up in June, the economic outlook, June 2020, where they are also sort of looking at, the kind of impact of the recession caused by COVID. Now, one diagram that captivated my attention is this one. They have plotted actually an index of growth rate of world GDP income, as also the per capita income starting from 1871 onwards. So 1871 is the base year where it is 100. And you can see the diagram. For example, the yellow line essentially indicates the GDP, the real GDP. And of course, you have the per capita GDP is also indicated by the blue line. So if you are really looking at the long term, what you find is that you are seeing a kind of consistent upward trend. Maybe the rate of growth may slow down, one may still witness a significant long-term increase in income. And I think this is not just, for a 5-year or 10-year period. We are really looking at the long term, and especially for a crop like teak, which we are interested in the long term, we should be looking at, 50 years or even later. So 1871 to almost about 2020-21, we are seeing a consistent improvement. You can see the short-term fluctuations. I'll come to that later. The next component is the population growth. Now, you can see, for example, the population has grown from almost about 1 billion to over 7.5 billion by 2019. And of course, the population distribution has changed quite a lot. And all the indications are that although the rate of growth may sort of decline, there may be a kind of leveling off, but still the population will grow to over, say, 9.5 billion by 2050 and just slightly over that by 2100. These are all based on projections made by the UN Population Division. They have sort of periodically updates the kind of trends and projections and provide. So basically, you find that population is definitely going to go up. Although the rate of growth may differ, and also there may be a kind of redistribution in the population, especially for the younger population. What you find because of various policies, and of course there are other demographic factors like urbanization and other things working. Now, the third factor which is going to determine is the environmental issues, which is actually a kind of new thing. Climate change will have a major impact on most human pursuits, and a probable shift towards a green path to economic development. I think this is we should realistically expect, because there is a major concern, especially on account of the Paris Agreement, although of course there are still problems about some countries keeping out of it. But still, I think there is a major consensus that to reduce carbon emission and keep the temperature to acceptable level, I think we need to really move on to a green path to economic development. And forestry, including teak sector, could become more important on account of the rapid growth in the demand for green products, especially for wood for construction. I think the whole idea of wood is a good product. It is less energy intensive. It sequesters carbon, and of course, carbon sequestration and biodiversity conservation potentials of forests becoming giving more emphasis for planted forests, and also for other land uses like agroforestry and all those things. So when you look at all these things, the feeling. Of course, I also want to mention that the report also, World Bank report also indicates the kind of economic turbulence that has taken place. So during the last 150 years, there has been quite a number of economic recession. We have, for example, the 1914, of course, World War, and also the Spanish flu. And of course, then you have the recession in 1930-32. You have the 45-46, there is a recession. Then, of course, 2008-2009, there has been recession. And of course, now we are in 2020. We are so during and you can see the second diagram actually gives the number of countries which are affected by a recession. So right now, this is considered to be one of the worst recession that has been affected. Almost about 93% of the countries have been affected by the COVID-19 driven recession. But let us be aware, during the last 1.5 century, teak has flourished through several ups and downs. And I think this gives a kind of confidence that in the long run, putting money in teak will be still worthwhile. So although natural teak forests will cease to be important, plantations will continue to increase, wider application of productivity enhancing technologies. We are also seeing teak wood prices increasing steadily. There is a study done by ITTO, which very clearly indicates that over a long period, the teak prices have actually steadily grown. And definitely, climate change mitigation efforts could ensure a continued demand for teak wood. So the message which I want to emphasize is that no need to worry about teak in the long term. I think all the key drivers, of course, there will be short-term problems, which I'm coming to. So in the long term, we are pretty safe as far as teak is concerned. Now, let us look at the short term. I think we are in a highly disruptive short and medium term. And COVID-19 has been one of the most disruptive events in the recent decades. In fact, there was a report saying that when you really look at the last 150 years, probably this is probably the most disruptive. And earlier, the diagram I showed, almost about 93% of the countries have been affected by recession. So almost all the economies have been impacted. and considerable uncertainty. So at this point, I think we are still, countries are grappling with containing COVID. In fact, infections are still going up on a global level in several countries. So we are still in a period of tremendous uncertainty. So we are unable to answer how long the COVID-19 related recession will last and what will be the trajectory of socioeconomic development in the post-COVID-19 period. I think this is going to be the greatest challenge we are going to face. Now, recession has impacted all the sectors. All the forecasts suggest that a severe recession in almost all countries in 2020, and quite likely, although of course the World Economic Outlook provided by the World Bank suggests a kind of a recovery in 2021. Of course, they have very carefully indicated that this is entirely dependent upon how we are able to sort of tame COVID-19. So the economic outlook for June 2020 estimates that the 2020 you are going to see a kind of contraction of the world GDP to the extent of about 5.2%, which basically, if we translate, say, 135 trillion, this will be almost about $7 to $8 trillion, and the economy is contracting. More than 90% of the countries are affected by, and all key sectors, especially construction, travel, tourism, trade, everything is witness steep declines. Demand for wood. Now, remember, demand for wood is a derived demand, and the impact will be felt both from the supply side and the demand side. So the whole value chain has been sort of affected, and it has been disrupted. So this is a major challenge we are going to face. Now, one of the issues we have to look at is, if you take, for example, the major demand for teak wood, it is essentially for construction sector. Now, just last week, there was a study showing, how the housing sector has been affected in India. India is one of the major sort of importer of teak wood. Now, according to this study, they have actually compared between the different quarters. You see, for example, the housing plunge is almost about 54% in the first half of 2000. There is a steep decline in the sale of houses. And the same situation with the office space leasing. I think that is estimated to be almost about 37% loss. The reduction in the office space leasing. You are all familiar now. We are all working from home. So people are sort of not going to office. So the impact of this on timber, especially for construction and furniture, is going to be very significant. Now, this is not something new. I think this has been the case earlier also. Yeah, I'm sure you remember the 2007-2008 recession. The housing, the kind of in US plunged from almost about 2.5 million units to almost about 500,000, and this has a tremendous impact on the forestry sector. So I think this is the major challenge that we are going to face. We are also seeing a significant trade decline. Now, this is a report that was produced recently by the World Trade Organization, their trade statistics and outlook. And you can see, for example, how, of course, these are the two scenarios they are visualizing. Even with an optimistic scenario, it will take quite some time for the trade to really get back. And of course, if the ability to control COVID doesn't work well, I think we are going to see a significant continued decline in trade. And I think the recovery is going to be extremely slow. Now, very interesting, there has been an umpteen number of studies now on what is the post-COVID scenario. I think this has become a pastime for almost every consultancy organization. And we have very different scenarios have been sort of projected. Now, of course, interesting thing is that the English vocabulary has given quite a number of alphabets to represent the different scenarios. Now, you can see, for example, there is a scenario where what we call as the V scenario, where the decline is very sharp, and then of course it just catches up and then it goes to the old pattern. We also have a kind of slow recovery, which we call as a U recovery. That is another scenario that has been worked out. There is also another W scenario. W scenario is where you find that there is an initial recovery, but then COVID-19 sort of remains untamed. There is another phase of infection, and countries going for further lockdown, and of course, which means you have a W pattern of development. The worst scenario, in fact, the most pessimistic scenario is what they call as a L-shaped scenario, where you have a decline and then, of course, it remains unchanging for a very, very long time. Now, unfortunately, we have no idea of how long this is going to last. Now, the issue is that we are in a period of turbulence and uncertainty whose contours are very unclear. Some of the segments and players in the teak sector are in a better position to adopt. So when you really look at the whole value chain, I mean, starting from the producer to the consumer, and of course the various inputs coming from, you find that some of the segments are in a better position. And for example, those involved in the growing of teak has the option of keeping the trees on the ground and gain from the increment. I think this is something which we have to keep in mind. The greatest challenge will be for those involved in processing and trade. And I think what we have to keep in mind is that this will be very severe for the small and medium enterprises, especially in the informal sector. Now, just today I was going through one of the reports on the small and medium enterprises, and it was said that the small and medium enterprises are going to face a kind of mass extinction. I think this is the kind of situation that we have to really confront. So in this situation, I would say that some mortality is unavoidable. Many processing and trading enterprises face multiple problems. They face the problem both from the demand side and the supply side. They will need significant support to thrive. But unfortunately, that support may not come through because the support has to largely come from the government or the private sector, whatever. And all of them are under extreme stress for resources. So especially those with somewhat, to use the medical language or the health language, those with comorbidity problems like inefficient, loss-making, low productivity, they are likely to perish even if they are put on ICUs or ventilators. And this may not be a bad thing. Eventually, when we come out of this, we'll have a more efficient, productive, and stronger sector. Sorry to be very negative about this. So let me sum up this one. I think I am already reaching the time. Though there have been ups and downs, recessions, pandemics, etc., teak sector has flourished during the last 150 years. So we need not worry about the long-term prospects of teak, but the next couple of years and possibly a few more will be a period of uncertainty and turbulence. And the problem is that we are at this stage unable to measure or find out what is it's going to be the real impact. Those involved in growing teak has the option of being harvest and still gaining by keeping the trees on the ground. I think on the people who are growing the teak, of course, still few will face the problem, but I think they still have one option. Those in the processing and trading segments of the value chain will face severe challenges from both the demand and supply ends, and the informal sector will be particularly impacted. And of course, we need targeted interventions for each segment to enhance resilience. But then the problem is that we cannot come up with a very generalized intervention. It has to be highly targeted and context specific, and of course, looking at what exactly are the resources. But some mortality is unavoidable, especially if they have comorbidity factors, and probably we'll have to accept it as part of the evolution of a healthy and vibrant sector. I think that's my last slide. Thank you very much. I'm not able to hear you. I'm not able to hear you.
Yeah, is it audible now?
Yeah, it's audible. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So we have got a couple of questions.
Yes.
Afzal has asked, as you have mentioned the Paris Agreement,
Yes.
how do the teak growers avail carbon credits under this agreement?
Well, I think it's not just availing carbon credits alone, because what I've been sort of emphasizing is that the role of teak as a construction material, and especially in the context of the emphasis on using less energy intensive products, I think there is a massive shift is likely to go to use timber as the construction material. And I think this is where the role of teak actually comes. Of course, the carbon credit and other thing, that's a very different issue. We'll have to deal with the whole issue of carbon markets and the whole issue of trading. But from a kind of perspective, the long-term perspective, my emphasis is much more on using teak as a construction material, and in the process sort of contributing to eliminating other energy intensive high carbon footprint material, and then sort of so that's what I'm emphasizing. The whole idea of carbon credit is something different that of course anybody can actually sort of work, and I think we should also sort of really look at that potential of teak plantations for providing carbon credit, and I think there is a lot of initiatives in this direction. But what I am emphasizing is in the long term that teak as a kind of viable construction material, replacing other high carbon footprint materials.
Jose from Kerala and Lawrence from Ghana have raised the same issue of middlemen who determine the price of teak. So
I think there are two things that we have to emphasize. One, in some situations, the middleman cannot be sort of completely eliminated, because middleman actually comes when you have kind of problems in the supply chain. So the only option is basically to have a better access to information. And I think that is actually improving. I mean, even an organization like TEAKNET, I think this is a very important role to play. So the idea would be that once you have a kind of improved transparency and easy access to information, I think the ability of middlemen to exploit actually sort of minimize. And this has happened with a large number of crops. So I am very optimistic about it, especially with the rapid development in information technology. The ability of middlemen to sort of exploit the producers, I think that's going to go down. And this has happened in a number of products. So I think our emphasis should be actually to sort of, eliminating middlemen may not be an option, because in some situations, middlemen are absolutely essential. All that we want, we don't want middlemen to do the kind of exploitative, approach. I mean, so that can be prevented only through better information.
Okay. Lasse has put in a question, will there be an oversupply of plantation teak in the coming years, as most of the plantations which were established in the last 20 years will be in their first final harvest cycle?
Well, you see, you are seeing, I mean, you have to make a distinction between who is actually raising the plantations. You have, for example, public sector plantations. In fact, still, it is a dominant player. Governments raising plantations. I think they are relatively of a long rotation crops. What you are finding is the short rotation plantations is mostly by the big, the investors who are really want to sort of make profit at a short term. So, and again, the issue is that which market it is actually targeting. The point I would like to see, the quantity of plant material coming from short rotation crops may not be that high. And again, the problem is that at this point, teak timber is in short supply. The prices are very high, and I don't think there will be a kind of real oversupply, because after all, the quantity that is going to come is not really going to be that much. I mean, of course, I mean, if you really go on a mathematical board, like 2.5 million hectares at say 5 or 10 cubic meter, you'll get but still the quantity involved is not really going to be that much.
Yeah, Maria has posted a question like, do you foresee a major impact in roundwood teak prices?
No, I would wish them to draw attention to the ITTO study over the last few years. And I think what you are finding is a kind of very gradual increase. I think something like 4 to 6% on an annual basis. And that again is because I think the demand is still high. Now, for example, if you ask anyone who is constructing a house and ask them, are they going to use teak? The first response is that one, it's difficult to get. Second, I mean, the prices are very high. So I think it's not going to be a big problem, because whatever said and done, teak still maintains, even plantation teak still maintains, I mean, demand, because recognized as a good quality material, durable, workable, and most important, it is easy to grow.
Mauricio has posted, how much have the teak prices gone down with the reduced demand?
Well, it's very difficult to say that, because for the last few months there has been no sale. I mean, you look at the situation in Myanmar. I mean, I think since March, I think they are not really. I don't know. They are supposed to open the sales I think yesterday. I have no idea. But in many places, no sales have actually taken place, and it is very difficult to say how much it has gone. In fact, there has been a virtual standstill of markets. People have not been able to bring timber from the forest because of lockdown. The mills have not worked. Quite a large number of mills have closed down, or they are only working for very limited capacity. There has been no export, and I don't know whether you are aware that the number of ships actually stranded in the sea is very large. So I think the situation, it is still, we have no idea. Definitely there has been no construction activity, and probably the demand is very little. So we cannot say how much the prices have gone down, because there is no statistics on this one.
Yeah, Devendra Pante has asked, the teak faces challenges with from engineered wood. So he would like to get a view, your view on this.
Well, engineered wood is there, but again, if you really look at the long term, in terms of the demand for housing, if you consider the growth in population, growth in income, engineered wood means you still need a kind of very artificial strengthening and that kind of thing. So my feeling is that the demand for natural timber, essentially from its impact on carbon footprint, I think it is going to be still there. I'm not visualizing, and in fact, teak wood also could be used as a sort of product, I mean, for engineered wood, I mean, in various ways, you know. So I'm not anticipating much of a problem with engineered wood.
Yeah. So Anup has posted whether most of the wood that is coming to India is basically juvenile wood. So won't that raise the wood quality issues?
Well, I don't know. I think there has been a lot of studies on this one in terms of, I mean, the juvenile wood and other things. So yes, I mean, at least, I mean, I don't know whether, I don't remember exactly, but I think KFRA and others, even Agriculture University has done quite a bit of work on this one. I feel that, I mean, it may be a problem, but still there is a demand for, you know, when you compare with other alternatives, I think still there is a preference for teak, I mean, for various reasons.
Okay. Juan has posted whether if there is no demand, we can maintain our teak stands, but how well are we informed about the market situation? And how can we have access to this market information?
Well, this is something which I think an entrepreneur has to really find out. I mean, because of course, I mean, there are, I mean, organizations tracking the markets. There are also sort of at the national level and the local level. And I think this is something which has to be done quite a bit at the local level rather than, of course, we also have an idea of what's going to happen in the global market, like say organizations like ITTO, FAO, and you know, they are also sort of tracking that. But I think the next couple of years is going to be very, very problematic, and especially countries which are almost entirely geared for exports. Now, for example, I know in some of the countries in Southern America, almost all their output is, I mean, exported. I mean, especially to countries like India, and I think the problem is going to be a kind, you know, really severe, you know. But at least, I mean, the option is, I mean, you know, keep the trees on the ground so that they sort of add value. And I'm sure when the market picks up, definitely, I mean, you know, you'll be able to recover the cost of keeping the trees on the ground.
Yeah, so Devraj has posted what is the ideal economic rotation for teak?
Well, it depends on the end use and of course, I mean, the growth rate and all those things. It actually sort of varies, I mean, in different places. And, you know, and again, it is precisely based on the objective of the owner. If you are going to maximize the internal rate of return, probably where the current annual increment is probably, you know, advantageous. Probably you can sort of have a shorter rotation. Whereas if you are really looking for high value products for very unique niche markets, I think it will be advantageous to keep it for a little longer. Maybe, you know, there are situations where, you know, people have gone for 60, 70. When I joined the forestry service, the prevailing rotation was 80 years, and then it came down to 60 years and that kind of thing. So you can actually work out precisely what's the rotation depending upon the specific growing condition and the kind of market. You know, it's not difficult.
Yeah. Jose has posted that in spite of COVID, he notes that the demand for teak wood is high. So what can be the possible reason?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure whether this is confined to a specific area or a kind of global phenomenon. Now, of course, there are people who are actually sort of using teak for luxury items, paneling, furniture, and that kind of thing. So they are the relatively well-off people. So probably for them, the impact of COVID has not been sort of felt so much. So probably if there is a market, I mean, it's going to be very limited, confined to the kind of customers or the clients who are relatively in the high income group. What I understand from the overall economic situation, a lot of the people have actually deferred major expenditure, because at the moment, I think there is a tremendous insecurity about future jobs. And people are actually not spending anything, and they are trying to keep the money themselves. So there may be, aberrations, and I presume that this may be a bit of aberration, and I think it will be confined to a small area.
Okay, Dr. Shyam Vishwanath has posted, can bamboo timber pose a challenge to teak in the present or in the future?
I think it is more a kind of complementary, because in the case of teak, the advantage is that, if you say teak, everyone knows its properties. They have been, it has been in the market for, centuries in a way. So you don't have to really market it. But when it comes to sort of bamboo, still it is a grass, and, you need to really market it. So I think it is going to take a long time for bamboo to catch up with teak. And the other reason is that, it's very easy to grow teak. The technology is known. It has been highly standardized. The management practices have been standardized. Now, you see, for example, every homestead, you take in smallholders, whether it is Indonesia or Laopedia, Sri Lanka, India, especially in Kerala, we find that every homestead is having teak. So I don't think people need to be told about it. And you will find that private investors, rather than investing in bamboo, they would rather actually sort of invest in teak, because it provides a lot of flexibility. They are assured of the product. And I think that definitely teak has an advantage in the long term.
Yeah. Rajesh has posed a question on the quality of teak from agroforestry and plantation. Is there any difference between the two?
I'm not qualified to, I'm not a wood scientist, to say, but most of the available information indicate that the difference in terms of strength and other things, it's not, maybe the grain and other thing may not be that much, but I'm not sure it is really, that important. I know that, of course, the old natural teak stands, sort of slow grown, probably have a better figure, maybe, there are certain advantages. But in terms of plantation grown and home garden or homestead grown teak, there is very little difference. In fact, just a few months back, I harvested a few trees, from my home garden and converted into furniture. I didn't find any kind of difference in the properties.
Okay. Yeah. So Pavitra has come up with a question. What is the percentage of wood that can be used to make high-end products? That is among the total production. So is there any statistics, something related to that?
No, I don't think. See, even the limited statistics available, we don't have a complete information of the actual quantity of wood produced and how it is apportioned between the different components, how much of it. So a lot of the statistics we have is basically, a kind of, it's useful, but I don't think we have a kind of very accurate information. And again, the point is that we don't need 100% accurate. As long as you get a kind of reasonable information, I think that's and in terms of even, for example, the area under plantations, productivity, trade, I think we are in the domain where there are still a lot of unknowns. And I think this is an area where an organization like TEAKNET and research institute will have to sort of step in and improve the availability of better information.
Dr. Sajeev has asked, with new challenges to forestry as a science, like global warming, water retention, wildlife conflicts, and zoonotics, do you think production forestry will be pushed to the back burner in the public sector?
I don't think, we can completely, exclude production forestry.
So the
The point what I want to emphasize is that we are really talking about nature-based solutions for climate change and other sort of environmental issues. So if you are sort of pushing timber out of production, where are we going to produce? Of course, we can produce some in the kind of home gardens and farms to some extent. Yes, definitely there will be a bit of shift from traditional forests like big plantations to home gardens. But again, the quantity that can be produced from home gardens will not be quite significant. So we still have to rely on production from our forests and from plantations. And I think it will be unrealistic to assume that we can completely give up the idea of plantation forestry completely. And of course, what we have to try to do is, ensure that even plantation forestry, we have options to sort of ensure that you deal with improved carbon sequestration. You try to sort of focus on ensuring that there is no problem with biodiversity conservation. You can still ensure that the water shed values are protected. So I think we should be really looking at the kind of management practices which actually sort of generate multiple products and benefits, not just the kind of monoculture plantations.
So Munisho has posted whether there has been bigger emphasis on shortening the rotations.
Well, shortening the rotation is largely related to two things: the demand in market and the perception of the people who are actually making the investment. And in fact, if you really look at, for example, the public sector plantations, it has been a relatively longer rotation because the public sector is able to really look at a long-term vision. I think they are not interested in the immediate profit. But if you are a private investor, I think there is a tendency to sort of go for short-term. And if there is a market, I think the fundamental issue is that whether you are going to have a market, and then of course you can actually sort of shorten the rotation. But I must also add that there are private sector and people who are managing home gardens for much longer rotation. They are not looking at, short-term profit. They are looking at this as a long-term investment. People in some of the home gardens, you have trees which are, say, 40, 50 years old, and they are not going to harvest it until there is a kind of emergency or something like that. So what we are seeing is a kind of highly diversified system with a production system with different stakeholders, different owners, different objectives, different technologies, different ownership. So it's a very fascinating system at this stage, And so I'm happy that we have moved from a kind of very traditional public sector oriented natural forest or plantation management to a highly diversified system. And I think this provides tremendous amount of stability to the teak sector.
Walter has posted what on the role of certification in trade of teak, and does it have an impact on the prices and market access?
Well, certification is going to be a major issue, but interesting thing is that at this stage there are two things. If you really look at it in the case of teak, yes, there is a sort of niche market in Europe for sort of deckings and products, and I think there, and of course furniture, some item of furniture, there is a kind of emphasis on certification. But a huge quantity that is coming to markets, especially in India and China, I think the willingness of the consumer to pay a premium for certified products is, I think, very little. So I think this is where the certification is going to fail to some extent, unless the markets are, very keen to have certified material and willing to pay a premium for that. I think certification may not work. And the other issue also what we have to address is that the whole certification process, because I think we need to really improve the certification system to make it less expensive. And especially we need to really think of new technologies like, say, the blockchain technology to sort of, make sure that, because at the end of the day, we are not going to go for harvesting from any natural forest. Most of the teak is grown either in plantations or in homesteads or, so here we are essentially dealing with the, smallholders and that kind of thing. So we need to think of a certification system that is, adequate for them. And remember, most of the smallholders, what they are doing, there is no illegality issue involved, and I think a lot of them are managing it on a sustainable basis. So we need to really simplify the certification system. Otherwise, the current certification system, especially the third-party certification system, which is very expensive. Of course, efforts have been made actually to sort of make it less expensive, but still, if it has to be widely accepted, I think we have to think of various other options.
Juvon has posted that teak stands in Thailand, Myanmar, Lavopedia poses natural stands, and these stands are affected by pests and diseases. So, can you share some experiences or lessons learned from other countries with respect to the management of these pests and diseases?
Well, I'm sure, there are quite a number of very competent people to answer this. I mean, we have very eminent entomologists and pathologists who have worked on this problem. And even I remember some of my former colleagues in the Forest Research Institute have worked on, the impact of the pest and disease outbreak, and especially, it's like, say, Hiblia pura or, Eutectona maceralis, on teak. I think there is a lot of material available on that. And I'm sure TEAKNET will be able to provide most of the information relating to how pest and disease management is carried out in teak plantations. I think this is an area where tremendous amount of work has been done. And I'm sure, TEAKNET should be able to provide that information.
Yeah, Dr. U.M. Chandrasekhara has also posted a similar question on teak management. So I think that in the coming webinars, we will be basically concentrating on the management practices, silvicultural operations of teak. So basically, I think more of the solutions can come through that webinars. And so Dr. Srikanth has posted, what is your view on seed viability of teak plantation, both financial and technical grounds?
Seed viability and financial, I'm not very clear about that question.
Teak plantation. What is your view on seed viability of teak plantation, both from the financial and technical ground? So if Dr. Srikanth can clarify that, we are moving to the next question. On a policy perspective, with production, trade, and consumption happening in the informal sector, how critical is the role of local market or governance, given that the informal sector caters to a large social base? This was the question posted by Dr. Anita.
Well, I think the greatest challenge is actually to accommodate, the informal sector. Now, a lot of the informal sector has opted to remain informal because of the rigidities of rules and regulations. What we do is that when we create, a set of rules and regulations, a framework, a lot of activities or sectors or individuals are captured in that, but you have a huge number actually remaining there. So I think there is a need to really look at, the informal sector, how they are actually operating, how they are surviving. And of course, the problem is that incorporating into the formal domain may not be always the answer, because it's often convenient to sort of operate in the informal domain because it provides a tremendous amount of flexibility and adaptability. So I think whatever we do, we are going to see a kind of a huge informal sector. And however much you try to come up with rules, regulations, and other things, there may be, a kind of informal activities and informal sector. But the most important thing is that I think we need to really have a very level playing field with regard to rules and regulations, enabling many of the people who are operating in the informal domain to be part of the formal domain. Because at the moment, the formal domain is much more rigid. You have all the requirements of licensing, rules, regulations, and other things. And that makes, extremely challenging.
Pavitra has asked, in India, which state have best collection of teakwood products?
I think you should be able to answer that. From the TEAKNET side, because I think it is very difficult to say, because this is when you say teak product, you have a wide range of products. It varies. So I think every state has its own sort of advantages and disadvantages. Of course, for example, we have Nilambur teak as a kind of geographical. We have a GI tag for that, and then of course we have the MP teak, we have the Myanmar teak. So I think it's very difficult to sort of say which is product, because I think every product, everything has its own sort of role, and it has its own market. So I think I wouldn't really like to sort of compare and say which is best. I think across the states and across the countries, I think we should not really make a comparison, because each actually is operating in their own specific context.
And basically she likes to have an idea about the furniture or antique pieces, but the idea is something like, as Dr. CTS has pointed out, the region growing the best teak need not be always producing the best furniture and antique pieces, because it moves across the country, and the industries are also very scattered. So it usually takes what you basically look for in a furniture or antique piece. That can be very region specific. And we cannot, as he has pointed out, we cannot basically make a comparison between this region is producing the best furnitures for teak than the other. Manmohan has asked, where lies future for promoting teak cultivation in India? I think he is concerned about the region where the promotion of teak can take place in the coming future, given the cheap and freely available import.
Well, I think, the reason why we are importing, we are not able to produce our requirements. And this is the interesting thing. Once India was exporting teak, now India is importing. And if you really look at, the productivity of our plantations, I think there is a lot to sort of improve. So I think it is not the question of, the imported stuff, sort of crowding out, our domestic production. We are not producing enough. And if you look at our plantations, the average productivity is extremely low. The technology used, still very outdated. The management practices are still, far from satisfactory. You go to any of the old teak plantation, and we are not managing it professionally. I think this is actually the problem. So I think there is a lot to do with the kind of available resources, available land, and I think, and who is actually investing in other countries? It is actually, if you look at, there are people from India investing in Africa. There are people who India investing in Central America. So the reason is that they feel that it is actually cheaper to sort of invest in those countries where land is not a problem. There are no hassles, even when they incur the enormous cost of transportation over long distances.
Balasubramanian has asked, please share us your views on quality performance of tissue culture teaks when compared to natural teak worldwide. Audible ആണോ? Sir, audible ആണോ? ഇവിടെ കേൾക്കുന്നില്ലല്ലോ. Yeah, I think the am I audible? Yeah, Dr. Ma from ITTO has posted, what are your views on further increase the demand for teak woods from young generation? How to enhance the young generation perceptions of teak products compared to rubber wood furniture? And how can we promote the biodiversity conservation potential in teak forest?
സാറിന് ഓഡിബിൾ അല്ല, CTS സാർ ഓഡിബിൾ അല്ല. അപ്പൊ എങ്ങനെ സാറിനെ അറിയിക്കാം?
Sir,
സാറിന് കേൾക്കില്ല.
sir, you are not audible.
I can hear you.
Yeah. Now it's okay. Now it's okay.
Okay. No, I think we should not really make a comparison between the rubber wood furniture and teak wood furniture. I think each has its own sort of specific demand. And from the point of view of natural wood quality strength, I think there will be always this teak will remain, I mean, a preferred one. Rubber, of course, is a kind of, it is a cheaper one. It has a sort of variety of users and processing technologies. So I think both, in terms of technology, both are sort of progressing. But I still feel that teak wood will, because it's in terms of its natural wood quality, in terms of strength and appearance, I think it will have a sort of unique market. And of course, there are differences in markets. There are certain markets where color, white or sort of light color is preferred, whereas there are other markets where they prefer with slightly yellowish and designs and other things. So I think they're going to be what we call as a segmented markets. In terms of the other question about biodiversity and other thing, what we feel is that there has been a lot of effort in the past actually to sort of raise mixed plantations and other thing. Now, what we feel is that, for example, the home gardens is becoming a kind of situation where you can produce timber. It also sort of maintains biodiversity. It produces other commodities. So essentially, I think there is going to be a lot of emphasis for the mixed cropping systems, which provides both, timber and other products. Even in plantations, I think there is a potential. Quite some time back, we had mixed plantations. In fact, when I joined the service, we have actually done mixed plantations with different species. But then this was a time in the 70s and 80s where we became too much focused on short-term income. And I think we completely abandoned the idea of mixed cropping and mixed plantations. Probably, I think it is time to really have a relook at mixed cropping, even in forests, to make sure that we are not just focusing on timber, but other ecosystem services and even other products.
Sri Kumar has posed a question asking about intercropping in teak to generate income, middle term income.
Yeah.
your take on that here, sir.
Well, I think this is actually mentioned. In fact, this is where the teak production system is actually diversifying. You do have, for example, the early system of Tongia, which actually produced wood, and of course now, if you really focus on the kind of farming systems where teak is actually one of the crop, I think there is a potential for combining the different products in one area. In fact, almost all the home garden systems, whether it is in Indonesia and Java, or even in, say, Vietnam, in Laos, in Sri Lanka, even here, I think this is where, this is one system of production. But the point is that, I'm not expecting, all our plantations to completely move into that kind of thing. I know, for example, in some of the countries and even in Kerala, what's happening is we have the kind of some of the low productivity plantations, which, over a period of time have become, in our enthusiasm to expand teak plantations, we have actually taken to areas where the productivity is extremely low. So there is an effort actually to revert it back to kind of natural growth, to make sure that they provide ecosystem services and focus attention on areas which are more productive and sort of concentrate resources on those areas.
Sri Humar has again posted a question on the tissue culture plants. Compared to compared to plantations, whether this would be having a better growth and return.
Tissue culture helps at the initial stage. But at the end of the day, what really matters in the case of most plantations is basically the actual management practices in the field. So if you don't sort of, I think a lot of the problem is related to our poor management practices in the field. Now, I have seen, for example, tissue culture material being planted and the other traditional one planted. But if you don't manage it properly, and if you don't invest in proper management, I think the tissue culture material is not really going to give you the proposed yield at all. So I think it is not just enough to have a kind of a good planting material. I think much more thrust has to be given to the management, or what we call as a nurture. That's the most important thing.
The questions which had been answered earlier, a similar one has again been posted, like growing sandal and red sanders fetches more economic gain in 20 to 25 years compared to teak in Tamil Nadu.
Well, I think this is purely a question of economic viability, and the two are different products. So if you are interested and if you are looking at economic returns, I think you can choose any crop. It may be teak, it may be sandalwood, or anything. So I think it is entirely left to the choice of the individual, their assessment of what is profitable. So we don't want to have a competition with between different species. We are not saying that everyone should plant teak. I think one has to really assess what is profitable. What we are saying is that it has a kind of long-term future.
I think we have come to the end of the questions. So some of us, as I have pointed out earlier, that in our coming webinars, we will be covering a broad range of topic which will be concentrating more on silvicultural management, management of plantations, raising smallholder plantations, biodiversity conservation. Some of these questions can be posted over after that particular topics, and I think the experts can give you a better answer from a very global perspective. Thank you, Dr. CTS, for giving us a very comprehensive report on the lecture on the topic, especially assuring us that in the long term, teak holds good and assuring that the market will not fail us. So thank you for your thoughtful insights.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas, for supporting us in this endeavor. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas.
And you can still post your questions to TEAKNET. We will forward it to Dr. CTS Nair, and he will reply you. So even if you could not post your comments over here, you are always welcome to post it to us, so that we will be able to give come back to you with suitable responses. Thank you. Thank you all for supporting us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.